you very much, Sara. And yes, Sara is with us today, and Sara is a cultural anthropologist, and you are a postdoc researcher at Department of Gender Studies, Lund University, and you have done your ethnographic research in Argentina, Brazil, and England. Yes? Yes. Thank
Correct.
you very much, Sara. And
Oh, thank you.
yeah, and I requested you for this talk for the people who are trying to be an anthropologist or who are a novice anthropologist, and the young people who are doing some thesis and they are planning to do ethnographic research. So it is very important for them to learn some very basic and fundamental things about doing anthropology. So that's why I am here with you and you're here with me. Thank you very much.
Thank
So
you.
Sara, I will start from your experience as anthropologist. I have just mentioned your field of study in Argentina and Brazil and England. So
Yeah.
what was your experience as an anthropologist?
Well, chronologically, my first fieldwork experience was in England, which was it was when I was doing my master's degree at UCL there in London, and it was in the Department of Anthropology at UCL, and my research was at that point on Chilean families who had exiled in the UK towards the end of the dictatorship in Chile, which was in the 70s, late 70s. And so what I was studying was these kind of how from one generation to another, the memory of this traumatic event, such as the dictatorship and being perhaps like imprisoned and in some cases even tortured, how that traumatic memory would be passed on to the following generation. And at that point, the people I was interviewing were of my age, more or less. So they were basically the children of the exilees themselves. And my field work therefore was more, it was mostly interviews. But that being said, in London, where there were quite a few, children of these exilees that I then managed to contact through this thing called snowball sampling, which means that I had a couple of contacts that I knew personally already. And then through them, I was able to get a hold of more and more and more people. So I conducted interviews, but I also participated in a couple of community events, like a food fair where there were these, my informants would be promoting Chilean food and other cultural events such as, I don't know, a dancing competition as well. And this was because I wanted to not just interview them, but also see how that second generation Chilean community in London, whether there was any community to begin with, and if there was, how did it operate? What kinds of events did they, do together? So that was my first experience. And I mean, I was a novice anthropologist myself as well. So if I now look back to this, and this was 10 years ago, I'd be like, oh my God, all the things that I did. I think I definitely should have been a bit better prepared, for instance, for my interviews. But the good thing about this is that having that experience under my belt when I started my PhD, and that was in the US, I started constructing my project around questions of socioeconomic mobility and entrepreneurship in Argentina. And I had lived in Argentina when I was young, so I had lots of connections. I had friends there. I had what I call my fake family as well. So it was easy for me to go to my field site. But what made the experience a lot easier as well was that I had already had that baptism by fire during my master's degree. So in Argentina, my fieldwork was taking place and still takes place, except for that I haven't been there for a while because of the corona, in this very poor northwestern area, far from Buenos Aires. And I have been going there since 2014 as a researcher. And in total, I must have spent since 2014 until now, 2.5 years, almost 3 years, like intermittently, right?
Yeah.
And when I did the proper field work, the dissertation field work, I was there for 18 months in this same city where I have indeed, like the first time I was there was in 2000. So that was a bit of a while ago, right?
Yeah.
And I guess in that sense, my fieldwork experience it stands in the middle ground of what anthropologists often do, either as what you would call the native anthropologist. So an anthropologist who is from, for instance, Argentina and does research in Argentina. And then you have the other extreme of, say you are a French person and you have never been to Argentina before, but you come up with this exciting topic that you want to study in Argentina, and you study Spanish and you want to really go there, and then you end up going there and you do your field work there. So that's everything but a native anthropologist. And in my case, I'm a bit in the middle, because having a lot of experience, having many years of relationships over there, but at the same time, definitely not being Argentine myself. So that's important to say, because it means that I'm fluent, and I even speak the local dialect in Spanish. So that world is very easily accessible to me, linguistically speaking, but also in terms of the background of cultural knowledge that I already have, which is not something that you learn through textbooks if you are studying and, taking seminars and reading.
Yeah.
I mean, I should also mention that my fieldwork in Brazil was very short. I was there only for 3 months. This was 2016. And I was working specifically on a project where my supervisor, PhD supervisor, what he was conducting, and that he then ended up publishing a book on. So I sort of, latched on to that project and kind of rode the wave, contributed to it, and that was in Sao Paulo, which is very different from the very poor semi-rural place where I do my research normally in Argentina. And also I have a background in photography. So what I actually did was in Brazil, interestingly, was what you would call visual ethnography, which means that instead of just interviewing people and taking notes and recording what people say, I was photographing them. And I was photographing the area where we did our research, and our informants there kindly agreed to be photographed by me. So it was a very different kind of fieldwork experience in that sense. But on the whole, to summarize this, I'm very lucky to have been able to spend a lot of time in the field. And that's also because of having had the resources by the universities and other funding organizations that I've been lucky to get grants from. And I would say that the best part of doing anthropology and being an anthropology is being in the field and getting to do field work.
Good. So it was very interesting to know, because you told me about different methods, like you use photographic methods, kind of visual anthropology, and then you also use field notes, and you did some sort of participant observation as well, taking part in different activities, and then
very much
interviews. So these all somehow comprise your field work, actually. An interesting thing is that you said that you were non-native, but you also have some nativity in yourself. So you found yourself more powerful as an anthropologist because you know the cultural meanings of the things and the linguistic familiarity, or you found yourself trapped in something taken for granted?
That's a that's a really good question. And I always say, I've even said this to my students, in fact, yesterday in a class that I ran, but in general, that you're never either or. There is always a bit of you that has the, as you would say, the nativity, and at the same time, that little bit of an outsider's perspective. It's a spectrum, and the question is where you are in that spectrum and where your position also changes in that spectrum, between like starting with the full-on native anthropologist, ending as the not native at all. And for me, on the whole, it's been really beneficial. I think it has strengthened my work a lot. It has had very concrete implications in terms of knowing a lot of people. And one of the challenges, I think, when an anthropologist goes to the field without very deep prior knowledge of the place, is that it's not so easy to just implant yourself in a community and assume that, oh, people just want to talk to me. Like, it doesn't work like that, does it? And so in my case, the very fact that I've had years and years of not just experience, but also accumulating knowledge of that place, the people that I've known since over 20 years ago have obviously also, their lives have evolved, and I've seen how those lives evolve, and so there's been that connection to that place, which then has borne fruit when I've gone there as an anthropologist, because it's been like, hey, Pedro, do you know anybody who would like to? And then, you know, the chain sort of starts to open itself up.
Yeah.
Linguistically, of course, it makes a huge difference to not just speak the language of the country where you are, but also the local dialect, because I mean, that depends very much on your field site in general. But it means that you have that foot in that world that generates confidence in your informants, because they will feel more comfortable talking to you when not everything has to be explained, right? So with my informants, there would be lots of conversations where, indeed, as you mentioned yourself, many things are taken for granted by also my informants when they tell me about some occurrence in the 1990s, and I know exactly what it is because of having heard about it ever since I've been there for the first time. So not everything has to be unraveled and explained and unpacked, no? But that's the other side of the coin, is that there are these things, for instance, we often talk about native categories, right, as anthropologists. And for instance, my research, besides being about socioeconomic mobility, it was also, and perhaps even more so, about the ethno-racial differences within the population in Santiago del Estero, which is the town where I did research. And so there are ways of talking about different ethno-racial groups that are very local, and that for an outsider might seem either horrendously discriminative or just incomprehensible, right? And I sometimes found myself being in conversations where these kinds of nomenclature and labels and words are used, and I'm not even thinking about it because, yeah, I get it. And then when I listen to the transcription, the interviews, and I do the transcriptions or take my notes, I'm like, oh my God, like, you know, there are these words being used that I didn't even think about. And I didn't even think about their meaning until I'm looking at them in relation to my actual research question and topic. And that's where I kind of catch myself being in that native position. The point is not whether it's good or bad. The point is what you can do with it when you realize it afterwards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is, you know, whenever we think about our anthropological work or ethnographic research, there are a lot of things that we can reflect upon. and they
Absolutely.
not possible in a short talk anyways. But anyhow, we got a glimpse from whatever you are telling about the challenges of doing anthropology, especially even if you think that you are having a strength of being native and non-native at the same time, but this multiple positionalities and actually experiencing the multiple identities of a researcher, it is a very difficult task. I mean, shifting from one identity to another one, and bracketing something as taken for granted, and then thinking about the participant-centered meaning of that thing. So it is all very much challenging and a lot of skills required to do that.
And I absolutely, and I would add to that that it's the those kinds of shifts, if you like, in the different identity hats that you wear.
Mhm.
Um, as an anthropologist who is there, let's say semi-native, and as an anthropologist that then has to detach herself from that from that environment in order to have a bit of a more distant analysis on what's going on. But the other dimension is also that if you are in a place that you're familiar with, where you have, whether it be your own country, your own town, or indeed a place where you have spent years of your life, I mean, going and coming or living, you also have to recognize that you're not always an anthropologist,
Uh,
that you also are somebody who has a life of her own that has nothing to do with
yeah,
your research. And that transition is also very tricky, because if you spend your day participating in the lives and activities of your informants, for instance, by helping somebody in their shop because you want to understand how this kind of small entrepreneurship happens, and you're there and you're chatting to the owner and you're maybe chatting to the customers and you're helping because you also want to be part of it,
mhm,
and then you step outside the store, and next thing you go to the same store as a customer because you have to buy milk.
yeah,
So those are the moments when you have to kind of renegotiate your very not just your positionality, but really, what kind of a person am I right now? Am I just a laywoman, or am I the researcher? Am I an expert, or am I just somebody who desperately needs a bottle of milk and that's it? No.
yeah,
And that's another thing that especially those who do research in their own familiar surroundings will face as a bit of a challenge that may kind of startle you at
yeah,
sometimes, like at times as well.
exactly. Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, Sarah, now you know that whenever we are doing anthropology or doing ethnographic research, we already expect that there would be a multi-method research. So a single
Yeah,
method would not work for an anthropologist probably. So what
yeah.
do you think that the novice researchers or young researchers who are planning to do a field work or planning to conduct a study based on ethnographic research, what kind of methodological skills they should at least have with them before going to the field?
um I would, first of all these different methodologies, they really materialize as, I mean, part of your knowledge kit only once when you immerse yourself in that work in the field. And that's important to bear in mind, because it kind of lets you off the hook, in the sense that you don't have to think that you should know everything prior to going to the field. Instead, you should know that you don't know everything, and
Excellent.
that you will acquire more and more skills through the practice as you are in the field. Having said that, of course, you do have to have basic knowledge, and you have to minimally know what these methods that are at the core of anthropological discipline and research are. For instance, what does participant observation mean? And it's one of these things that we often kind of throw it as like, oh yeah, we do participant observation, but what does it really mean, right? um, and the same goes for interviews, which is there, the question is not so much about the meaning of the interview, but rather about having already some sort of a preconception of what kinds of techniques you can use to facilitate an interview. So for instance, if you plan to conduct, let's say 30 interviews with your informants who are, for instance, shopkeepers, right? Small shopkeepers and street vendors. You should be aware of there being certain common topics that these people might be interested in like not just what you are interested in, but also things that you can think of as potentially interesting to your informants, which you can use as an introduction before you actually jump into an actual interview, which means to break the ice or to elicit conversation from your informant. Should you go and use, for instance, certain photos when you sit down with your informants and say like, oh, you know, here is this like one shop that I saw. What do you think about this? And so have a repertoire of potential small scale skills in your mind that will basically make your life easier as you jump into the deep end of interviewing. But also, obviously, you know, another method that we use a lot in terms of sampling is snowballing. And again, well, we snowball. What does it mean? Like we throw snowballs? No. Have an idea of what you can do as a beginning anthropologist to start finding informants, which is not just, it's not a walk in the park. So you have access to one person, know that through that one person, you may gain access to other people and then to other people. And if you are aware of that before you go into the field, you can already take a bit of a sigh of relief knowing that it's not all going to be so unpredictable and new, right? So those, I would say, are things to have in mind and to have like a little bit of prior knowledge of before you go there and start hanging out, as we say, as anthropologists.
Yeah. So if I would count them on fingers, what you have guided us, that number one, at least you should have a student or a researcher who is planning to do a field work should have well awareness about the terms, whatever, for example, what is participant observation? It is not an observation, it is participant observation. So
exactly,
you should think about it very hard. What is this? Then doing an interview is not a desktop interview. You are going to a real world and we are
exactly.
So your target should be giving voices to the participants, and then the person who is being interviewed, I mean the interviewees, they are actually the agent and the active persons who must be considered in your interviews. And then these interviews does not go like a structured paper form interviews. They may be unstructured, yeah?
Yes, and there's always room for literally improvisation, because if your informant says something that you hadn't even thought about, and you're like, oh my God, what is this? Well, be prepared to follow that line of conversation instead of just being like, okay, the informant said something that I don't know anything about. Oh, let's just put it under the rug and carry on, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It means that maybe you think something irrelevant to our so-called research questions, and you may skip that, and that is a mistake because you are doing ethnography. So nothing is invented, everything is data.
Exactly. And that's, I mean, it as in connection, in direct connection to that, my supervisor always used to tell me, just follow the data, follow the data. And part and parcel of that is what you also call as the ethnographic imperative, which means that you don't go to the field just, you know, armed with this one idea that you're basically going to test. And still, if your hypothesis, which we often even don't have as anthropologists, but let's say you have this preconceived idea of some sort of a social phenomenon that you're going to study. And if the stuff that happens on the ground doesn't match your preconceived idea, then you're like, okay, this didn't work out. No, that's not what one is supposed to do at all. Instead, the ethnographic imperative means that you are there in the field absorbing information, and the data that you absorb will also guide your own thinking and the direction that your research might take. And it might be completely unexpected. And it might, in fact, completely change your research question as well, because you realize that maybe I'm not asking the right question, because the data seems to suggest that this question is actually the question I should be asking, not that question.
Exactly. So you see that we say that flexibility is the strength of qualitative research, and that is actually experienced in ethnographic research, because
absolutely
it is very much a demand for anthropologists to be flexible with the data. Okay, then you talk about sampling, and it is very interesting because usually people end up with purposive sampling or convenient sampling techniques while doing a traditional qualitative research. But yes, snowball sampling is something that actually it is somehow related to kind of doing sampling in grounded theory.
Exactly.
Like you go step by step and you try to reach to the core of that phenomena through different reasons. And it means that then an ethnographer should have a good communication skill, because he also wants to communicate his first participant that he wants to reach another participant through that participant. So
absolutely,
it requires a kind of convincing communication.
Absolutely, and this is perhaps the most important rule that any anthropologist should have, and that's to listen. Like you have to listen. That's your first and foremost task as an ethnographer. And once when you know how to listen, your communication skills with your the subjects of your research, or call them informants or interlocutors, is going to be infinitely easier. No, and that means also that in fluid conversation with your informant, the fact that you listen actually sows confidence, and it sows empathy, it sows a sort of situation of trust, right? And when that happens, it'll be much easier also for you as the researcher to say that, look, okay, so I really want my cohort of interlocutors to grow. Who do you think it would be a good person for me to contact? Or can you perhaps help me in reaching out to this person? So what I'm saying with this is that, yes, you can have a, you know, like a structured interview with somebody and then be like, give me the phone number of your friend who I could talk to as well.
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't fly too well. It might work, but it might not. Whereas if you have a fluent conversation already established, and then you have a semi-structured interview, maybe two, then you probably already have so much ground of trust that you can very comfortably be asking that, well, you know, could you please help me? And it would be really nice if you could, you know, lend me your hand here and there and so on. And that's when you start getting access to more and more people, because that person who will give you the contact of another person will also tell that other person that, you know, this researcher is actually a good person. Don't worry about it. You know, she's not a spy and she's not a uncovered agent or any of those things.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So it means about good listening. I think it is also included in that your interviewee, that person you are going to do interview, he or she must feel like this man or woman who is interviewing me, actually they are interested in my life.
Exactly. Absolutely. And once, this is a general rule of thumb that it's not, obviously you cannot generalize it, but it is quite general, which is that we do like to talk about our lives. If somebody shows that interest that you just mentioned. And I'm not now talking about, you know, traumatic events we may have or anything, like just in general, if I'm being asked about my life in a nice way, and I feel that this other person who is asking me about my life is actually excited to hear what I have to say, then that I will likely tell about my life and kind of, talk about it openly even.
Yeah.
So that's something that the anthropologist or the researcher in general should always bear in mind, that if, like, your first and foremost task is to listen,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
And through that listening, then sow comfort and confidence.
Exactly.
And there's no way round about it. There's, if you go there with arrogance and assuming that all your, like, the only task you have is to extract information
Ah.
and data from
Mm.
the other person as if the other person was a robot,
Mm.
then that's no good.
Yeah, that's not good.
That's
Well,
no good.
sometimes doing interview, the people who are doing it for the first time, they end up with putting their one leg on the other leg and with a spot face,
Yeah,
and just like listening in a way like they are just indifferent whatever the emotions the person carries with whatever words he is saying, but they are just interested. Okay, this is data. Okay, let him put it in the box.
yeah.
This will not work as an anthropologist, I think.
No. And as an anthropologist, one should also bear in mind that uh, not only the interviews that one conducts, but also the experience of doing participant observation, even observations in general, are primarily a sensorial experience.
Hmm.
It's not just about your, auditively collecting information and writing it down and like seeing with your eyes what the other person, how the other person acts or maneuvers or, body or whatever. But it's also about being there, in with all your senses.
Exactly.
And it's important not to, like, we don't think about it actively as such, do we? We don't think about, oh, I'm smelling stuff and that's information and data.
Hmm.
But if we really want to take a more holistic view onto what it means to conduct grounded research, ethnographic research, then you have to be mindful about the fact that you are there with your entire body, with all the senses you have. The antennae are on, right? And in that sense, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I just remember with whatever you were saying, that when I was doing live field work in a village, and it was a winter, and I had a breakfast with them, with the family I was visiting, and I had a breakfast with them near the stove where they were sitting, and it was a traditional breakfast. And after these few years, I still, whenever I recall that memory of being a participant observer and enjoying that breakfast with them, I can even still feel the smell and flavor of that breakfast and the weather and everything. So that's somehow
Exactly.
how much you should be a receptor all the way. I mean, that
Absolutely.
even after 10 years, you recall your field work, you feel like, oh, I am there. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Like I think you hit the nail on its head, because same thing. And I even wrote about these things in my dissertation, that Santiago, my field site, is one of the hottest areas in the entire South America.
Mm.
So the summer temperatures, and the summer is there, starts in November. I mean, it's the opposite of the Northern Hemisphere. So the Santiago summer, it starts already, but like September, and it lasts until March, April.
Mm.
And when I say summer, it's peak temperatures up to 48, 49 degrees, no?
Mm.
And let's say it's not that extreme every day, but the average temperatures are all the time between 32 and 39, 38. And so one of the constant experiences for me, and I've spent 3 summers there altogether, has always been the horror of stepping out of your house, walking to the street, and thinking like, oh my God, I have to go to this place now and walk, let's say, 1 kilometer only, but I'll be soaking, and how will I look, and will I smell sweaty? And those are kind of the questions that, again, we don't think about,
Yeah.
but are fundamental in the experience of being there, and now being there with capital letters, right? But at the same time, like what you're describing about the breakfast, for instance, the similar way, I remember the relief when I would go to see, for instance, I had a couple of informants who had a bakery and a kiosk, and they had AC.
Yeah.
My God, what a relief. And that already makes the following, whether it would be about just hanging out in the bakery or actually kind of talking to the bakery workers and so on, you're more comfortable, right? So it's all about, like, not all about, but also about that sensory experience of discomfort and comfort that very much informs the way that you do your research. And not a minor thing. Like, it's actually a very substantial part of the stuff that you do, the research that you do.
So it means that we have even much more non-verbal data with us as compared to the verbal data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in that sense, I know, we often say that everything is data. And I would say, fair enough. Rather than that, everything can be data. So all the information that we perceive, yes, of course, we can claim it to be data. The question is really, what do you make of it? And how can you use the information that you perceive in a way that becomes relevant data for you in your research? No? And therefore, these kinds of sensory experiences, wonderful description that you just gave about the breakfast, where I would imagine that it's not just the cold outside and the warmth of the fire, but also the taste of what you've eaten and the smell of the chai that you've had, and so on. And that all becomes this big bundle that you can use as data, right?
And that's what I think when we say that we need thick description when we are writing about ethnography. We cannot write a thick description until we don't actually acquire these non-verbal data with the verbal data to write that description. Well, that is interesting. Okay, but the last question to conclude something, because now actually I hope that people who will watch this video, they can understand actually the basic or fundamental skills that they must have before going to the field. So they should do ethnography if they have interest in it. If they are not interested in it, they should not do it.
Exactly. Precisely.
Yeah.
And I would add to that quickly that your research is always better when you actually enjoy, like when you're not just interested in your research question, but that you're actually even passionate about it.
Exactly.
And because when you have that impetus to really want to do something, that means that you invest yourself more in that. And that brings us back to this, what we've been now discussing so much, which is the sensorial experience of being there and absorbing information and stimuli from around you all the time, and with keen interest to do so, not just because, damn it, I have to do this, right?
Good. Okay, Sara, last question, and that is
Yes.
somehow related to the main context of the field. For example, we see that we can divide the whole world in two poles, global south and global north. And sometimes we say that global south has a collectivist culture and global north has individualistic culture. Or you can say Western and non-Western context.
Yeah.
We have experience doing research in both the context.
Mm.
So what do you think, that is there any difference of approach when you are doing research in non-Western context or in Western context?
I think the first question is, where are you as the researcher from? Because of course, if you are from what could be called the global south and you do research in the global south, this is a horrible generalization, of course, but in relation to the question that you're posing, there is a marked difference. And the trouble with anthropology is that the roots of our noble discipline are obviously in a world that was that still had the belief in the hierarchy of societies and cultural evolution, and basically suggesting that the white man who is educated in Oxford or Cambridge goes to the Pacific Islands and studies the primitive peoples and the natives, collects data, goes back to Cambridge or Oxford and writes an interesting article, almost as if saying that, oh my God, look at these exotic primitive tribes. And thank heavens we've come a long way from that.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't change the fact that if you, and I mean, I'm very blunt about this, but of course, if you are a Scandinavian person doing, let's say you're Swedish, you and I are now in Sweden, and you conduct research in Sweden, say Norway or Denmark, for instance, your relationship to that place is very different than if you are from, in your case, Azer, like you, from Pakistan, and you conduct research over here. You have a very different position and positionality and a scope of understanding regarding the phenomena that happens over here. And I think it's, I mean, I don't mean to tie this back to the question of native and non-native, but it certainly implies that that the things of the individuality, for instance, you would notice that so much better than that Swedish person who kind of feels that, this is how I need that 2 meter space between me and my informants always. but similarly, and this is say for myself, well, I have lived in many countries and many of them have been in what you would call the global south. So it's perhaps a little different, but of course, my being from the Nordics, I'm from Finland, and going and conducting research in Argentina or in Brazil for that matter, means that I have to really work hard to adjust myself to understanding what some basic things such as collective or social means in that context. Because as you say, they're very different. The meanings are very different than what the concept of social or collective mean in this neck of the woods, in this part of the world. If that, I don't know, like I'm kind of sort of going around about your question a bit, but I hope it's.
But it is understandable that actually the researcher's own background is also very much important.
Absolutely.
When he's or she's doing an anthropology. Because yes, you're very right, because when we are talking about the colonial anthropologist, well, maybe I'm sorry if I'm using this word, because
exactly, they were colonialists. Let's not like they were colonialists, full stop.
Yeah, because I remember that I have studied somewhere that when the Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, they were under the British rule, so the British anthropologists come to India to conduct anthropology, and then the local people translate data for them, and then they go and publish their research as an author. So sometimes I feel that who is providing them the meaning of that thing that they have observed or watched? So these meaning makers are just the local translators. So they are just
exactly. exactly. And that's the other thing that I mean, the curse of the colonial anthropology was also not just the arrogance, and I mean, well, we don't have to get into that conversation too much, but what you're implying is the lack of not just cultural but linguistic knowledge, which means that the translation of data would happen on two levels. On the one hand, the figurative level, where indeed your local contact person or gatekeeper or key informant explains something to you, but provides his own or her own explanation, which might be very different from basically her own interpretation. But on top of that, there is the actual translation from the local language to, in this case, the English language. And so much can get lost in that process, right? So what that colonial anthropologist in this case would end up publishing is, I don't know if they would, like, any of those journal articles would really, withstand the test of reality. Yeah. Surely to a degree, but you know what I mean. And in that regard, I would always urge people to do research in a place where they have the necessary linguistic skills to not to have to rely on translators when it is about ethnography. Yeah. Obviously, if it's structured interviews, then that's a different deal. But for you to be able to participate in people's everyday lives, you have to have knowledge, language skills that allows you to do that.
And I think the best, the alternative approach is to do collaborative anthropology, where as a non-native and native anthropologists join together and they produce knowledge about some study area or something. Well, I mean,
that's true.
It's a long debate, but anyhow, conclusively, we have learned some key skills that we must carry on. For example, I would say that how to conduct interview is very important. You should have beforehand knowledge that what is an interview in ethnographic setting and how it should be done. And then giving voices to the participant is very important. And then whatever the participant is saying, everything is important, even if does not, it is not interesting for you, but it is interesting for the participant. That is a knowledge that you should not lose. Then exactly. To make a kind of snowball sampling, it is very important that you are very much into the people where you are living, and you are having a kind of rapport building and friendly conversation. So just build an informal world with them, be one of them, and then you will exactly find a kind of trust relationship with the people.
Exactly.
And then one thing we have learned about the participant observation, it is just not observation, it is participant observation. So you actually pretend to be a participant. So you are with them, you are one, just like you said that just being with the woman who is a shopkeeper and just dealing with the customers as well, and then also being a customer at the same time. So,
exactly.
So yeah, so it is very interesting, Sara, and I am sure that the people or the students who are thinking about doing ethnographic research, they will enjoy this conversation. And I know that doing a complete anthropology, it's also expensive and you need some funding. And usually university students, like the country in Pakistan, they don't have funds to do anthropology. But even then, if they are doing in their own villages or the towns or the cities where they belong to, because it is less expensive to conduct ethnography in their own setting, they should learn how to control their nativity, to not to be trapped by the taken for granted things, and just changing their positionalities while doing field work.
Absolutely. And I would even add to that it's a safe place to start, where you are close to your like when you, rather than like traveling to the other side of the world. It's a safe place to start when you start in your own neighborhood, so as to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Sara. Indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. If there is any weird noise in the background, it's because of my dog, by the way.
Yeah.
But no, thank you, Azir, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And I do hope that it serves for those who see these videos and subscribe to your channel as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, Sara, thank you. Bye.
Okay.